Okay, hello and good afternoon. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Catherine Fleming Bruce. I'm here in South Carolina. My organization is Tnovsa Global Commons, and today is the 5th of May, the day before the coronation of King Charles III. So because of that, and because we're in South Carolina and we have these historic and current connections to the state, I wanted to have a conversation with that on that subject. And the guest having the conversation with me, and I'm so grateful that you had time to talk with me today, is Dr. Woody Holton. Dr. Woody Holton is a history professor at the University of South Carolina, has written several books on the American Revolution, and he's going to be able to share a wealth of knowledge today. But what we want to talk about during the time we're together, we want to talk about the coronation happening this year in the UK, the presidency, which is under discussion and happening next year in the US, the historic and current connections between South Carolina and the United Kingdom, and a brief conversation about monarchy and coronation versus democracy. So why don't we start with just a little bit about some of the connections that we can think of between South Carolina and the United Kingdom. What are some things that come to mind to you, Dr. Holt?
Well, what we used to say is, and it used to seem obvious, was that South Carolina was settled by people from England, but we now know that that really needs to be qualified because large numbers of the people who came here did not come from England. The largest number was the group who came, if you take Africans collectively, they were the largest number here. And then actually, I really got interested in doing history as my profession from an advisor I had named Peter Wood, who wrote a book with a very simple title called Black Majority. Just a reminder that South Carolina for decades had an African-American majority. So yes, there are connections to Britain. They didn't start calling it Britain until 1707, so we could say England to be more precise. There are lots of English settlers, but even they tended to come in the early years, not directly from England, but from Barbados. And Peter Wood and others have described South Carolina in its early years not as a colony of England, but as a colony, that is a colony of Barbados. And they brought enslaved people from there. They brought laws regarding slavery from there, from Barbados as well. So I think for me, the main thing to know about our origins as a colony and now as a state is how diverse they are. Yes, there's the British connection, and the United States always talks today about how it has a special relationship with Great Britain, and I think that's helpful. We certainly have similar histories. For instance, we later became a colonial power ourselves, just like Britain, and so the United States and Britain have a lot of similarities, plus they also have some real advantages. Great wealth, partly based on that colonial exploitation, great freedom, which most of the world does not enjoy at the level that we do here in Britain and here in the United States, and they do in Britain. You know, there's a real, it's almost like a seesaw that some of that freedom was built on other people's enslavement, but
yes,
but we do have it, and there's a lot of people in both Britain and America who want to share it, starting with the anti-slavery people like Olaudah Equiano, who was born in South Carolina and as a slave, and ended up by purchasing his way out of slavery. He was a mariner, a sailor. He purchased his way out of slavery and became a major campaigner against slavery in Britain. So he kind of upsets all of the origin stories because A, he's an African making a connection between Britain and South Carolina, and B, he didn't travel from Britain to South Carolina the way people imagine. He traveled from South Carolina to Britain, and he was part of this international movement against slavery that included African Americans like himself, but also white people who who began to see the evil of slavery. We all know the song Amazing Grace, and
Mhm.
sometimes forget, I bet you've never forgotten, that it was written by a slave ship captain, John Newton.
Yes. Yes, I heard.
And so there were people, even at the, as evil as you can imagine. It's not much worse you can imagine than a slave ship captain, but some of them converted in two senses: converted to Christ, and then as a consequence of that, converted to opposing slavery. And he was British, but we sing that song probably more here than they do. They play it on the bagpipe over there in Scotland, but we sing that song more here than they do in Britain. So yes, there are lots of continuing connections between Britain and the U.S. today.
And I want to do a quick screen share to show the connections in historical sites. Here we have at least 10 or so parts of South Carolina that have preserved some of the battlefields where some of the American Revolutionary War skirmishes and battles took place. So, Camden and 96, South Carolina. There's a location in Winsboro in Fairfield County that was one of the headquarters for the British soldiers there. So there are a number of places where people can actually go and physically see where these battles took place.
I'm glad you mentioned Winsboro, because lots of people know about Camden and Cowpens, maybe Kings Mountain, but not everybody knows about Winsboro. But that was a really important place. The British were on a roll through South Carolina. They captured Charleston on May 12, 1780, and then on to a big victory at Camden. But they were turned around after the Battle of Kings Mountain, where they lost to mostly militiamen, and kind of had to drop back to Winsboro. And then in Winsboro, and actually before that, the British faced a new enemy, which a pair of enemies, smallpox and malaria, which they were more susceptible to than locals, especially African-born locals, many of whom had the sickle cell trait that made them less vulnerable to malaria. They were still very vulnerable to yellow fever, but blacks and whites had much more experience with these tropical diseases in the British. And so those diseases really were kind of an ally of the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And there's even some people who say that without those pathogenic allies, or those two viruses, the smallpox and I'm sorry, the malaria and yellow fever, maybe we wouldn't have, the Patriots wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War. So I'm glad you mentioned Winsboro along with those two battle sites.
Right. And I did also want to mention the Royal African Company. Recently, we have been hearing that there's more acknowledgement and more research that is being done about connections between slaveholding and the royal family. So we've seen in this Royal African Company, which is one of the companies that was involved in the slave trade, actually some of the what we would call the founding fathers of South Carolina were owners of in that Royal African Company. One of whom was the Colleton. I can't remember his first name, but one of the this might be a list of them here. Okay, Sir Peter Colleton, for whom Colleton County was named here in South Carolina. We have Anthony Ashley Cooper, who
two rivers were named. Yes.
So those, we're thinking about our rivers and our bridges and our counties, but these are actually named after these leaders in the British community who were owners in this Royal African Company that were part of the slave trade.
I hadn't thought about this till you just mentioned Colleton County, but I bet if you added up the South Carolina counties that are named after people involved in the slave trade or just as slaveholders themselves, if you added that to, and I'm originally from Virginia, where tons of our counties are have Native American names, and we have fewer of those here, but we have a few of those as well. Like Chiraw, and so forth. If you took away the counties named after slaveholders and Native Americans, that'd be about half the counties, I think, if you put them together. So yeah, those are two parts of our history that are memorialized in the county names, although people don't always know that. They think, oh, Sumter County, that must be named after Fort Sumter. But of course, it's named after General Sumter, one of the great militia leaders of the Revolutionary War. But he also had a less admirable side, which was when he ran out of money to pay his troops, he paid them with enslaved people.
Exactly. So as we turn to the monarchy, the discussion of the monarchy and the presidency, how would we compare and contrast the fact that we now have a president and a democratic system, and they have a monarchical system, where we feel so strongly that our system is better? Do we have a strong democracy?
That is a very, very difficult question. I could dodge it by saying, well, no, we're not a democracy. We're never intended to be. It's a democratic republic. But no, I think it's a fair question that deserves to be confronted. And I'll make a controversial statement just to get us started here. And I would say that there are ways in which the British government is more responsive to the wishes of the people than the American government is, and that's by design, that's on purpose. And when I say that in other words, that the British government is more democratic than ours, I'm not making a value judgment there because that's not always a good thing. I don't like it. For instance, there's a lot of places where they elect judges. And I prefer appointed judges because you don't. I hate to see judges campaigning for election and things like that. But so there's sometimes democracy is a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But here's my argument that the British government is more democratic than ours today, and that is, I think just about everybody agrees that the monarchy there is very expensive, but it's really a tourist trap. It has very, very little power. It's hard for me to name anything that the king, that the other branches of the British government wanted, and either Queen Elizabeth during her long reign, or Charles III, who's only been in for a few months and gets crowned tomorrow. It's hard for me to think of something that the rest of the government wanted, and the king or queen was able to stop it. In fact, you can go all the way back to the period that I studied, the American Revolution. Even then, it would be an exaggeration to say that the King George III was only a figurehead. But he's the one they addressed the Declaration of Independence to. But most of the laws that the Declaration accuses him of adopting, bad laws that the colonists were protesting, they didn't really come from him. They came from Parliament and from the cabinet. Which, the whole idea of having a presidential cabinet like we have now, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and so forth, that came from Britain. So much of what we have was copied from Britain. But my point is that today, if I can just get a law through the House of Commons, then it becomes the law of the land in Britain. And again, that may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing, but it's fairly easy to get a law passed there. One of the most controversial things they've done recently is exit the European Union, Brexit. Right. You and I could argue for an hour whether that's a good thing or bad thing, but all I'm saying is it was fairly easy to get through. Of course, they then had a vote on it, but a popular vote on it. But compare that to here, where to get a law passed, I've got to get it through the House of Representatives and then the Senate, and then the president could still veto it, and then even then the Supreme Court could overturn it. Right. And so our government is kind of designed, not in the Declaration of Independence, this happened later with the adoption of the Constitution in 1787. Our government is kind of designed to get nothing done, except huge stuff that has to get done. And then people debate what's huge and has to be done. But it is ironic that, well, for instance, you were comparing the American president to the King of King of Britain. Everybody would agree that the American president is much more powerful than the King of Britain. The King of Britain is richer. He's got all these castles and stuff. But our president certainly has much more political power. And I think somebody like Thomas Jefferson or any of the American revolutionaries from South Carolina, like the Lawrences or the Draytons or any of these others, they'd be kind of astonished that we have a more monarchical system than Britain does, in the sense that our president, although elected, unlike their king, has this immense amount of power in the hands of one person. And like democracy, you could say it's great that we have a strong president. Others, like Arthur Schlesinger, about 50 years ago, wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency. And he said, whoa, this has gotten out of hand. I think that was Schlesinger. I'm gonna look it up while we're talking. But a lot of people are worried about a so-called imperial presidency. And I'll be candid with you and say I'm worried about that too. So I like some of the recent presidents. I dislike other recent presidents, but as an institution, I think it's gotten too much power. So frankly, if I was either Biden or Trump running for president, I'd say, stop complaining about the fact that I'm so old. It's good that I'm so old because I can't do too much damage. I need a nap every
right.
afternoon.
I see what you mean. And we're also looking at, here in South Carolina, where we have the moved the Democratic Party from the first in the South presidential primary to the first in the nation. The GOP is also up front and center in the presidential race process, because, of course, recently we had Donald Trump's launch with the governor and a number of other people. We have Nikki Haley, former governor, who's running. We have the potential of Tim Scott running, the senator from South Carolina. So there's going to be a lot of attention on South Carolina during both sides of this race. So I think part of the impetus for us is to demonstrate our democratic principle through our participatory processes, through our making sure that we have as many people as engaged as possible as we can, and also to make sure that we're transparent and accountable in our processes to elect and to protect the vote.
I thoroughly agree. And as you know, the vote, just the basic right that we thought was cleared up with the 15th Amendment that allowed formerly enslaved men to vote, and the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. We thought that was settled. Well, really not until 1965. I was already 6 years old when the Voting Rights Act was adopted. We thought that was settled, but now it has become unsettled,
yes,
specifically by the Supreme Court, which freed Southern states, basically, who had been under a restriction they had earned by preventing African Americans from voting. The Supreme Court lifted that restriction in a court case named after Eric Holder, Shelby County versus Eric Holder, who was Attorney General at the time. And that has had horrendous results. Little petty evil things like Georgia says, if you got a long line of people waiting to vote, which you and I can be candid, you don't see long lines in the leafy neighborhoods. Right. You see long lines in the poor neighborhoods, in the Black neighborhoods.
Yes.
And that's the case in a Georgia precinct. You and I can't go and hand out bottles of water to people in line. That's a crime in Georgia. And they did that knowing that would reduce the number of Black people who voted. And so to me, that's it's not as evil as what was happening during the civil rights struggle, where people were being murdered for trying to vote, but it's in the same bandwidth as that, in my opinion.
Exactly. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring our conversation to a close. We wanted to just have a quick opportunity to talk and point out these issues. I want to point everybody to a number of our fabulous sites in South Carolina where they can learn more about the American Revolution. We want to focus on South Carolina Department of Archives and History as a great place to get those ancient documents. So we want to look at Camden and Winnsboro and other locations, but most of all, we want to focus on our Constitution, our South Carolina Constitution, our U.S. Constitution. We want to protect our right to vote, and we want to make sure as many people are engaged this year, even as we watch tomorrow. Those of you who are watching the Coronation, we want to make sure that we have a coronation versus a democracy? Do we have a coronation next year, or do we have an election? Let's make sure we have an election. So I'm Catherine Fleming Bruce. Thanks so much, Dr. Woody Holton, for joining me today. And we appreciate all of you who are watching. Thank you so much.
Thank you.